Lynn on the screen. Lynn is the chair of the ATSC organization, and he's the board chair. And it's a real treat to hear Lynn speak in the United States. We get to hear him a lot. We thought we'd share him with you. He has the mind of a technologist and the heart of a poet, and I've always found his presentations to be kind of special in a certain way. So Lynn, why don't you take it from here? Lynn is going to talk about the current state of ATSC 3 development in the United States.
Well, thank you, Josh. You are too kind. It's a pleasure to be speaking to this international audience today, and especially to our friends in Korea. I'm Lynn Clauding. I'm Senior Vice President of Technology at NAB, but today I'm speaking to you in my role with the Advanced Television Systems Committee, where I have had the privilege of serving as the chairperson of the board of directors for the past 3 years. If I can just get my slide to change. There we go. We have many friendships, partnerships, commonalities between the US and Korea in broadcasting, but I specifically want to point out the ATSC 3.0 connection and talk a little about ATSC 3 in the US and ATSC 3 in Korea and ATSC in general as a bridge between the US and Korean broadcasters. Many in the US are, of course, familiar with the importance of Samsung and LG as technology companies in the ATSC, well-known brands, and they contributed to the development and the implementation of ATSC 3.0. But among ATSC's 150 or so members, over 10% of that membership is made up of Korean companies. And some are well known and some are not as well known in the US, but all of whom have been quite important in the history and the continuing story of ATSC. So first of all, on behalf of all the ATSC board and ATSC President Madeline Noland, I want to recognize and thank the Korean companies on this page. I hope I got them all. And thank you for contributing technology and time to ATSC endeavors. We would not have the excellent system we have now without the contributions that you have made and continue to make. The story of ATSC is a long one, and it began at the end of the US DTV transition in 2009, when ATSC members started discussing about, well, what's next after we go all digital? And so that began a period of planning for the next 2 years or so, and then standard setting began, and that started producing results in the first of the 20-some standards around 2016. And standards for the US were completed in 2018, and stations began going on the air really just last year in the US. But Korea, of course, implemented first, having back-timed from the Korean Winter Olympics of 2018, adopted ATSC 3 in 2016, and stations began going on the air in the middle of 2017. So we in the US recognized the significance of this early adoption. We know it paved the way for the US in many ways and made our introduction of ATSC 3.0 easier and more economical for both broadcasters and television set manufacturers. So thank you and congratulations. In the US, we say Next Gen TV and ATSC 3.0 interchangeably. The former name's familiar to the consumer audience. ATSC 3.0 is more for the technical world, but of course it's the same thing. And the attraction of the many things you can do with ATSC 3.0 would take a long time to fully explain to someone who didn't know about them. So we often talk about an elevator pitch, an explanation that could happen in an elevator ride. So for ATSC, it might need to be an elevator in a very tall skyscraper to have enough time, but there are basically 3 categories of benefits. And I've kind of color-coded them here, green, blue, and orange. Whereas UHD-TV and immersive audio were clearly the initial motivation in Korea. And the availability of 4K images and advanced sound, it made a clear distinction with the HDTV service. In the US, we're also interested in better pictures and sound, but it's hard for us. Full 4K is difficult to implement in the transition because unlike Korea, we did not receive additional allocations of spectrum from the government. So services that require high data rates are challenging for us. In the US, much of the attention is directed on better reception to traditional and non-traditional and stationary and moving receivers, and the lure of personalizing and interacting with the broadcast material. So since we don't have additional spectrum, the idea of augmenting spectrum is very attractive in the US. And these are immediate benefits to consumers. Future extensibility is also a motivator for broadcasters. And efficient use of spectrum is something we like to remind the US regulator about, and that we're using spectrum responsibly. Excuse me. And then the last line is the scary part, really for everyone, that ATSC 3 is not backward compatible with ATSC 1. And the price of a great future is the break with the past. So when the USD-TV transition took place between 1998 and 2009, we had channels 2 to 69. And that was enough for all broadcasters to have a second channel to simulcast DTV. And as a result of the transition and spectrum auctions, broadcasting now only occupies channels 2 to 36. It's just about 50% of what we had in the DTV transition. And the problem with that is that we have about the same number of broadcasters, about 1,700. So the transition is at the spectrum management level very challenging, to say the least. In addition, the way the broadcast spectrum is regulated is quite different. In the DTV transition, because spectrum was being reclaimed at the end of the transition, it was mandated. Broadcasters were required to transition. It was a very strict prescribed time frame. And it's totally different with ATSC 3.0, which is allowed on a voluntary basis as of November 2017, but there's no set timetable, and broadcasters are not required to use next-gen TV at all if they don't want to. So since there is no additional spectrum, we have to share the existing spectrum if you want to do ATSC 3.0. And it's a very simple idea, but it gets complicated pretty fast. There's a red broadcaster and a green broadcaster, and they each transmit an HD signal and two other signals, probably standard definition quality. We call them diginets in the US, and they are lesser quality programming, but they're popular. And in this channel sharing example, all the DTV programming from both channels is put on the green channel, and the red channel is then shared between the two stations for ATSC 3.0. And it works, but each station only has half the bandwidth that they had previously. So it's not something you want to be on a permanent basis. In a typical US market, you might have 6 stations, each with an HD signal and 3 of these SD diginet channels. And channel sharing to free up the most channels for ATSC3 is challenging. So even with the best compression and statistical multiplexing in this example, mixing and matching would allow at most 2 channels to be cleared for ATSC 3.0. And those channels would need to support the ATSC 3.0 services from all 6 broadcasters. So this is the way it's being deployed in the US. And despite the challenges, we have a lot of stations going on the air now. Roughly 40 markets have begun next-gen TV. A number of other markets plan to go on the air by the end of this year or very soon after. and other markets that are working out their schedule, but they plan to do so. So this is a very successful start to the transition in the US. The orange areas on this map are markets that are on the air. The light blue are markets that are close to being on the air. And the dark blue shows markets that are in the planning stage. But overall, this makes up about 60 markets, and about 75% of the population is covered in those markets. Meanwhile, we have TV set manufacturing from at least 3 manufacturers. It is also voluntary. In the DTV transition, it was mandatory. But set sales are off to a very good start. When the first sets really became available in the US in 2020, sales this year in 2021 will be something over 2 million, and are expected to be over 31 million in 2025, and that would represent about 75% of all US set sales. So the orange bars on here show the cumulative number of sets, and by the end of 2025, that would be something over 68 million. And at that point, ATSC 3.0 will certainly be considered a mass market and pretty much assumed by consumers to be the future of television, which the television industry already assumes it's the future of television. As far as ATSC 3.0 itself, there is serious interest in countries other than the US and Korea. As you might expect, Canada and Mexico very likely to follow the example of the US, although they'll lag behind. You may be aware Brazil is very active in an international competition for its next broadcast standard, and ATSC 3.0 is one of the very strong competitors in that process, which should conclude next year. And then there's an ongoing evaluation of ATSC 3.0 in India. Some of you are very involved in that, both in Korea and the US. But they are interested in offloading some of the traffic on the overloaded mobile phone network onto the somewhat underutilized broadcast spectrum. ATSC has a continuing demonstration in India showing the practical advantages of ATSC 3.0. This might be where we first see ATSC 3 chips in phones. And Jamaica has announced they're going to transition from analog directly to ATSC 3.0. They're actively planning that transition now. And that may be where we see very inexpensive digital converter boxes come into the marketplace as part of the Jamaican transition. And then finally, there's a concerted effort in the International Telecommunications Union, headquartered in Geneva, to fully document the ATSC 3 standard in all the digital television ITU documentation. And ATSC is involved in that as well. Several Korean organizations, including ETRI, have been instrumental at the ITU in making progress there. And then finally, here's some of the activities that ATSC is looking at aimed at the next steps beyond ATSC 3.0. A request for proposals on a core network for ATSC 3.0 was released just last week. It's available on the ATSC website now, and initial responses are due at the end of the year. That's, of course, aimed at standard setting. The implementation team on tower networks is looking at how you distribute signals between towers. That has significant Korean participation. The new ad hoc group on 5G harmonization is looking at where there may be commonalities and interface points between 5G and ATSC 3.0 systems. And there is a long-term planning group, planning team 4, that regularly reports on new communications technologies and makes recommendations on what new technologies might be of interest and might be relevant to future ATSC systems. So that's my brief review of the state of ATSC. I want to thank you again for organizing this forum and discussion. Apologize for my sore throat, but I look forward to answering your questions and to continue to work together in the future. Thanks.